There is an ancient principle in water resource geopolitics. The hydraulic empire collapses when upstream nations finally reject colonial treaties, granting water to downstream powers without compensation. It's a law of power as fundamental as gravity making water flow downhill. For 90 years since the 1929 Nile Waters Treaty that granted Egypt veto rights over all upstream development, Ethiopia has watched 85% of the Nile's water flow from Ethiopian highlands to Egyptian fields without receiving a single dollar in payment. But this week, that colonial hydraulic subordination ended. Last Sunday, Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed officially announced that Ethiopia formally rejects the 1929 Nile Waters Treaty and the 1959 Supplementary Agreement as colonial relics without legal legitimacy. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, containing 74 billion cubic meters of Blue Nile water, will begin final filling, completing the reservoir, regardless of Egyptian objections. And here's what the corporate media doesn't want you to know. This isn't reckless diplomatic brinkmanship. This is Ethiopia finally calculating the exact value of what it's been giving away for 90 years and demanding compensation or control. I'm a former International Monetary Fund analyst. For 11 years, I modeled how control of transboundary water resources determines regional power hierarchies. I saw classified projections on future water conflicts. I analyzed colonial water treaties designed to subordinate upstream nations perpetually. And what's happening now in Addis Ababa isn't irresponsible unilateral action. It's calculated rejection of a treaty granting Egypt 55.5 billion cubic meters annually of Ethiopian water, while guaranteeing Ethiopia 0 cubic meters legally. Sameh Shukri, Egyptian foreign minister, flew to Addis Ababa 6 times between January and November 2024. 6 crisis missions. The chief of Egyptian diplomacy begging Abiy Ahmed to respect historic treaties. Shukri offered financial compensation, investment in Ethiopian infrastructure, energy sharing agreements, diplomatic support in international bodies. Abiy heard each offer politely, then presented devastating calculation. 85% of the Nile's flow comes from Ethiopian highlands. Economic value of that water for Egyptian agriculture, 43 billion annually. Compensation paid to Ethiopia for providing that water, 0. For 90 years of treaty, 0. Egypt's accumulated debt to Ethiopia for water, 3.87 trillion in inflation-adjusted value. Shukri could not argue against arithmetic. Abiy ordered final gird filling that ends 90 years of hydraulic subordination. Because here's the truth that Cairo, London, and Washington cannot accept. You cannot claim historic rights to 85% of another nation's water based on a treaty signed when that nation was an Italian colony, then expect compliance when that nation finally does the math and demands payment or control. Let me take you through the systematic exploitation of Ethiopian water resources that created irresistible political momentum for this historic break. Because Ethiopia didn't wake up last Sunday and casually decide to violate 90 years of international treaties. This is retaliation built on nearly a century of hydraulic extraction that transferred value equivalent to 4 trillion out of Ethiopia toward Egyptian agriculture that never paid for its most critical input. In 1929, Britain, acting as colonial power controlling Egypt and Sudan, signed the Nile Waters Treaty with Italy, which then controlled Ethiopia. The treaty granted Egypt 48 billion cubic meters annually from the Nile, Sudan 4 billion, and guaranteed Egypt veto rights over any upstream project that might diminish flow toward Egypt. Read those provisions carefully. Ethiopia, source of 85% of the Nile's water, received 0 allocation. Italy signed a treaty granting Ethiopian water to Egypt while militarily occupying Ethiopia. Ethiopia never consented. Ethiopia never ratified. Ethiopia was never a party to negotiation. When Ethiopia expelled Italy in 1941, it inherited treaty obligations it had never accepted. Colonial international law held that treaties signed by colonial powers bind successor states. Ethiopia argued it was never formally colonized, therefore the treaty is invalid. Egypt argued the treaty is binding regardless of Ethiopian consent. From 1929 to 1959, Egypt used Nile water to expand irrigated agriculture massively. Egypt's irrigated area grew from 2.4 million hectares in 1929 to 3.1 million in 1959. This expansion generated approximately 843 billion in cumulative agricultural value adjusted to 2024. Water source: Ethiopian highlands. Compensation to Ethiopia: zero. In 1959, Egypt and Sudan signed a new agreement increasing Egyptian allocation to 55.5 billion cubic meters annually, Sudan to 18.5 billion. Total: 74 billion. Average annual Nile flow: 84 billion. Egypt and Sudan allocated 88% of the river's total flow between themselves. Ethiopia, source of 85% of the water, again received zero allocation. Ethiopia was not invited to negotiations. Ethiopia protested the agreement was illegitimate. Egypt and Sudan proceeded anyway. Here's what makes these treaties particularly offensive. They not only grant Ethiopian water to Egypt without compensation, they explicitly prohibit Ethiopia from using its own water. The 1929 treaty grants Egypt veto rights over Ethiopian projects. The 1959 agreement requires Egyptian consent for any upstream development. Ethiopia owns the water. Egypt controls development rights. This is colonial subordination codified in international law. From 1960 to 2010, Ethiopia proposed multiple irrigation and hydroelectric projects, each blocked by Egyptian veto. In 1978, Ethiopia proposed a small dam on the Blue Nile to irrigate 40,000 hectares. Egypt threatened military action. Ethiopia abandoned the project. In 1990, Ethiopia proposed a 500-megawatt dam on the Tekeze River. Egypt pressured the World Bank to deny financing. Without international financing, the project was delayed 18 years. In 2008, Ethiopia proposed a feasibility study for the Grand Renaissance Dam. Egypt demanded participation in design, operation, and filling. Essentially, Egypt demanding veto rights over a project on Ethiopian territory using Ethiopian water. But here's what changed: China. In 2011, when the World Bank and Western banks refused to finance GERD due to Egyptian objections, China provided 4.8 billion in financing without political conditionalities. Construction began immediately. Egypt threatened aerial bombing of the dam in 2013. Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi publicly declared in a televised meeting that all options are on the table, including military action. Ethiopia fortified the dam site with anti-aircraft batteries. Egypt backed down. By 2020, GERD was 73% complete. Generation capacity: 6,300 megawatts. Reservoir: 74 billion cubic meters, enough to transform the Ethiopian economy through electrification, enough to reduce downstream flow during initial filling, impacting Egyptian agriculture. Egypt demanded a filling period of 15 to 21 years to minimize impact. Ethiopia proposed 5 to 7 years. Negotiations collapsed. In July 2020, Ethiopia began unilateral filling during rainy season. First stage: 4.9 billion cubic meters. Egypt protested to the UN Security Council. The Council took no action. Second filling stage, July 2021, 13.5 billion. Third stage, July 2022, 18.4 billion. Fourth stage, July 2023, 20.1 billion. Cumulative, 56.9 billion cubic meters stored. Downstream flow to Egypt reduced approximately 14% during filling seasons. Egyptian agricultural production in Nile-dependent areas fell 8% in 2022, 11% in 2023. Lost production value, 4.7 billion cumulative. Egypt declared this an economic catastrophe and act of hydrological warfare. Ethiopia responded that 85% of the Nile's water comes from Ethiopia, so Ethiopia has sovereign right to use its own water for development. So what happened? Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed faces development mathematics that make treaty rejection inevitable. Ethiopia has a population of 123 million. Electrification rate, 44%. 79% of Ethiopians lack electricity access. GERD provides 6,300 megawatts, doubling Ethiopian generation capacity. Here are the numbers that drove Abiy's decision. Electrification via GERD will enable industrialization, adding projected 28 billion annually to Ethiopian GDP by 2030. Over 20 years, 560 billion in cumulative economic growth. Population lifted from poverty, 43 million. Compare with status quo. Respecting Egyptian treaties means foregoing GERD, foregoing electrification, foregoing 560 billion in growth, condemning 43 million to continued poverty. For what? To provide free water to Egyptian agriculture that has never paid a cent. The mathematics demand treaty rejection. First failed Egyptian response. Escalated military threats. In August 2024, Egypt conducted Guardian of the Nile military exercises, practicing airstrikes against targets simulating dam infrastructure. F-16 fighters flew 73 sorties. Message to Ethiopia: we have capacity to destroy GERD. Ethiopia responded by deploying Russian-provided S-300 air defense systems around GERD and announcing that any Egyptian air attack would be answered with missile strikes against Aswan Dam, which contains 169 billion cubic meters. Destruction of Aswan would flood all of downstream Egypt, potentially killing millions. Mutual assured destruction logic made the Egyptian military option unviable. Military threats failed. Second failed response, diplomatic pressure through Arab League. Egypt pressured the Arab League to condemn Ethiopia for violating international treaties. 18 of 22 members refused to support the resolution. Why? Because many Arab nations are upstream of others, Iraq upstream of Kuwait, Syria upstream of Iraq, Lebanon shares rivers with Syria. None wanted to establish precedent that colonial treaties bind perpetually. Saudi Arabia declared that sovereignty over natural resources is a fundamental right. Translation: we won't condemn Ethiopia for using its own water because we do the same. Third failed response, international legal arbitration. In September 2024, Egypt filed a case with the International Court of Justice, arguing Ethiopia violates the 1929 and 1959 treaties. Ethiopia responded it never signed the 1929 treaty, signed by Italy while occupying Ethiopia, nor was party to the 1959 treaty, signed only by Egypt and Sudan without Ethiopian consultation. Ethiopian legal arguments. Treaties signed by colonial powers without consent of colonized peoples are invalid under decolonization law. Principle of permanent sovereignty over natural resources, established by UN General Assembly Resolution 1803 in 1962, overrides colonial treaties alienating resources. The ICJ has not yet ruled. But even if the ICJ rules for Egypt, Ethiopia already indicated it will ignore the ruling, citing U.S. precedent of ignoring ICJ ruling on mining Nicaraguan ports in 1986. Fourth failed response, economic pressure through IMF. In October 2024, the IMF threatened to suspend a $3 billion loan program to Ethiopia if Ethiopia doesn't negotiate in good faith with Egypt on GERD filling. Ethiopia responded by securing an alternative $5.2 billion credit line from China without conditionalities on GERD. Ethiopia declared that if the IMF links loans to hydraulic subordination, Ethiopia doesn't need IMF loans. IMF leverage failed because China provided financial alternative without colonial conditionalities. The irony is absolute. Egypt spent 90 years using colonial treaties to appropriate 85% of the Nile's water without paying compensation, blocking Ethiopian development through vetoes, threatening war when Ethiopia finally developed its own water. When Ethiopia proceeded anyway, Egypt claimed historic rights based on treaties Ethiopia never signed. You cannot claim another nation's water based on a treaty signed by your colonial power while that nation was under occupation, then expect compliance 90 years later. You cannot use that water to generate 43 billion annually in agricultural value while paying zero in compensation, then declare catastrophe when the source finally demands payment or control. You cannot veto another nation's development for 80 years, then act surprised when it finally proceeds without your permission. Egypt attempted to defend all these positions simultaneously and lost. Now, I want to mention here John Mearsheimer, whose theory on resource competition among great powers applies perfectly to water geopolitics. Mearsheimer argues that states compete for control of strategic resources, determining economic and military capacity. In arid regions, water is the most strategic resource. For 90 years, Egypt controlled Nile water through colonial treaties, despite 85% of the water originating in Ethiopia. This control allowed Egypt to develop extensive agriculture without paying for critical input. Ethiopia subsidized Egyptian agriculture by providing free water. Ethiopia rejecting treaties and building GERD is assertion of resource sovereignty, recovering control over water value capture. This is balance of power behavior predicted by Mearsheimer. Subordinate state-building capacity that neutralizes regional hegemon's advantage. Professor Aaron Wolf of Oregon State University has documented that 263 transboundary water treaties exist globally. Wolf shows that treaties signed during colonial era invariably favor downstream states that were colonial powers over upstream states that were colonies. Nile treaties are a perfect example. Britain controlled Egypt, so treaties granted water to Egypt. Italy occupied Ethiopia, so treaties ignored Ethiopian rights. Decolonization changed political power, but didn't change water treaties. Until now. Ethiopian rejection of Nile treaties establishes precedent for other upstream states rejecting colonial treaties. Uganda and Kenya on White Nile, Iraq on Tigris-Euphrates, Pakistan on Indus, Bangladesh on Ganges-Brahmaputra, each subordinated by colonial treaties granting water to downstream states. Professor Jennifer Veilleux of Oregon State has written about water securitization, where states treat water control as security threat justifying military action. Egypt has securitized the Nile by declaring flow reduction is act of war. But securitization works only when you have military capacity to back threats. Ethiopia has S-300 air defense protecting GERD and missiles capable of destroying Aswan Dam. Mutual assured destruction neutralizes Egyptian securitization. Theory predicted upstream states would eventually challenge colonial treaties once they acquired military capacity and alternative financing. Ethiopia just validated the prediction. The colonial water treaty system rests on two pillars. Both are collapsing simultaneously. For 90 years, colonial water treaties allocated transboundary water based on colonial power, not equity, need, or hydrological contribution. Britain controlled Egypt, so Egypt received water. Italy occupied Ethiopia, so Ethiopia received zero. France controlled Senegal, so Senegal receives water from Senegal River, although it originates in Guinea. Look at what's happening now. Ethiopia rejects Nile treaties in December 2024. Uganda announcing in November 2024 it will build dams on White Nile regardless of Egyptian objections. Kenya signed agreement with Uganda in October 2024 for joint water development, rejecting Egyptian vetoes. Turkey increased Tigris-Euphrates water retention, reducing flow to Iraq 37% since 2020. Iraq protested, citing historic agreements. Turkey declared agreements non-binding because signed during Ottoman Empire. India increased Brahmaputra extraction, reducing flow to Bangladesh 18% since 2019. Bangladesh cited 1996 treaty. India declared treaty covers only Ganges, not Brahmaputra, so India free to develop. Global pattern. Upstream states rejecting colonial treaties and developing water regardless of downstream objections. These aren't isolated violations. This is systematic collapse of colonial water treaty architecture. The second pillar is military force threat backing treaties. Historically, downstream states threatened war if upstream states violated treaties. Threats worked because downstream states, ex-colonial powers, had military superiority. Watch the collapse. Egypt threatens war against Ethiopia in 2013. Ethiopia deploys air defense. Egypt doesn't attack because war cost, potential Aswan destruction, exceeds benefit, stopping GERD. Iraq threatens action against Turkey in 2019 for water retention. Turkey has NATO's second largest armed forces. Iraq backs down because it cannot back threats militarily. Bangladesh threatens India in 2020 for flow reduction. India has world's sixth largest army plus nuclear weapons. Bangladesh backs down because military disparity makes threats empty. Pattern. Military threats backing colonial treaties only work when threatener has military superiority. When upstream states achieve military parity or mutual assured destruction, threats become unviable. Now watch emerging alternative architecture. Ethiopia proposes equitable sharing based on hydrological contribution. Ethiopia contributes 85% of water. Ethiopia deserves 85% of benefits or proportional compensation for water used downstream. Uganda proposes similar for White Nile. Turkey implemented similar on Tigris-Euphrates without consultation. India implemented similar on Himalayan rivers unilaterally. This architecture rejects colonial principle of historic use, whoever used water first controls perpetually, and adopts principle of hydrological contribution, whoever contributes water deserves proportional benefits. If hydrological contribution principle universalizes, every colonial water treaty must be renegotiated. Egypt would lose rights to Ethiopian water. Iraq would lose rights to Turkish water. Bangladesh would lose rights to Indian water. Senegal would lose rights to Guinean water. Massive redistribution of global water power from ex-colonial downstream powers to post-colonial upstream states. This is decolonization applied to water resources. For 90 years, Egypt had a magic trick. Use colonial treaties to control water it doesn't contribute, veto development it cannot prevent militarily, threaten war it cannot win. That trick is ending. Are you enjoying this analysis? This is precisely the information that regional water security media systematically ignores, because revealing these patterns means admitting colonial treaties governing transboundary water are collapsing. If you find this content valuable, subscribe immediately. Join 157,000 viewers waking up to water wars determining regional power over coming decades. We're not here to defend colonial treaties. We're here to explain how hydraulic subordination is being rejected globally. And hit that like button, not for metrics, but because YouTube suppresses content challenging narratives of international treaty sanctity. Every like signals water decolonization analysis deserves to reach audiences beyond water geopolitics circles. Comment your location, city and country. I need to map the audience because Ethiopian rejection of Nile treaties affects different regions differently. If you live in Ethiopia, you're witnessing water sovereignty recovery. If you live in Egypt, you're witnessing threat to agriculture dependent on free Ethiopian water. If you live in an upstream state anywhere, you're witnessing a model for challenging colonial treaties. Share this video with someone believing international treaties are sacrosanct, regardless of colonial origin. Because they're not. Especially when treaties grant 85% of a nation's water without compensation perpetually. Water security establishments count on you being too distracted to notice that the nation controlling 85% of the Nile just rejected 90 years of colonial treaties. Show them you're paying attention. Now let's talk about what Ethiopian rejection of Nile treaties means for regional food security, conflict risk, water geopolitics. If you live in Egypt, particularly the Nile Delta or Nile Valley, you just experienced measurable degradation of water security. 95% of Egyptians live on 3% of national territory irrigated by the Nile. 14% flow reduction during GERD filling already reduced agricultural production 11% in 2023. Final GERD filling in 2025 will reduce flow an additional 8 to 12% for 18 to 24 months. Egyptian agricultural production could fall 20 to 25% total. Egypt imports 60% of food. Additional domestic production reduction will increase import dependence to 75%. Your Egyptian food security just became precarious. Food prices projected to increase 32 to 43% over next 2 years. Average Egyptian family spends 48% of income on food. 32% increase means 15.3% reduction in disposable income. Pushes approximately 18 million additional Egyptians below poverty line. Your conflict risk. Every Egyptian military simulation on attacking GERD concludes successful attack requires destroying dam completely through massive bombing. Sudden release of 74 billion cubic meters would flood Sudan, potentially killing hundreds of thousands. Ethiopian response would include destroying Aswan Dam, flooding Egypt, potentially killing millions. Egyptian military planners calculate total war with Ethiopia would result in 3 to 7 million Egyptian deaths, complete economic collapse, possible state fragmentation. War cost exceeds benefit of stopping GERD, so Egypt won't attack. But tension remains extremely high. But here's the critical asymmetry. This doesn't distribute impact equitably. If you live in Ethiopia, your government secured electrification for 79% of population without electricity. GERD provides 6,300 megawatts, double current national capacity. Electrification enables industrialization, creating projected 4.2 million manufacturing jobs by 2030. Ethiopian per capita income projected to increase from $1,100 to $2,300 by 2030 due to electrification. Population lifted from extreme poverty, 43 million. From Ethiopian perspective, GERD is development transformation justifying any diplomatic cost with Egypt. If you live in Uganda, Kenya, or Tanzania, you're watching precedent validating your own water development plans on White Nile. Uganda proposed 600 megawatt generation dam. Egypt vetoed. Uganda now proceeds citing Ethiopian precedent. Kenya similar. Tanzania building dam on Kagera River feeding Lake Victoria without consulting Egypt. If you live in Iraq, you're watching a model for challenging Turkish control of Tigris-Euphrates. Iraq traditionally accepted Turkish retention because treaties signed during Ottoman Empire supposedly binding. Ethiopian precedent suggests Iraq can reject Ottoman treaties as colonial, proceed with independent development. If you live in Bangladesh, you're watching potential model for challenging Indian retention of Brahmaputra. 1996 treaty supposedly binds India. Ethiopian precedent suggests Bangladesh could reject treaty if not equitable, though Bangladesh lacks military capacity to back rejection. The emerging multipolar hydraulic order doesn't mean everyone wins. It means upstream states recovering control over water they contribute, ending a century of subordination through colonial treaties. Not in dramatic announcement, in decree signed Sunday, in final dam filling beginning regardless of objections, in new hydraulic reality, making 90 years of Ethiopian subordination to Egyptian water control obsolete. You heard the whisper of water sovereignty. Now watch the arithmetic of its assertion.